Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Linder, other members of the committee. I'm happy to be here today to talk about how we can improve the outcomes for children and families that come into contact with the child welfare system, and how waivers can and can't help us move in that direction. I feel very fortunate that I get to be the last witness to go, because a lot of the points that I want to make have already been made. The first point was really eloquently articulated by many of the witnesses, and that is that the current system, the current financing structure, is at odds with achieving the outcomes that we want to achieve for children. And I think Representative Kagi illustrated that beautifully when she talked about the child welfare worker who wanted to have some home visiting with a public health nurse, but she couldn't find that, and so her only option was to put the child in care. As long as we have that as our structure, we're going to continue to have outcomes that we don't like. So that leads me to my second point, which is if we really want to improve the outcomes, we have to take on comprehensive financing reform. We have to make changes to the system that really are available to all states and to all children and families. And I think that has two components to it. One is investing new resources in the system so that we can provide a lot of those front-end services of prevention and early intervention and treatment services for families. The second does involve redirection, which a lot of folks have talked about in terms of reallocating the resources we currently spend away from some of the out-of-home placements into other interventions. But I think redirection alone is not going to be sufficient. We've got to have an infusion of funds up front to make sure that we have the service capacity to bring down those caseloads. And I want to point to one number in particular that I think speaks to the reason we need those new investments. Right now, of the 750 to 100,000 to 1 million children that we know have been abused and neglected every year for the last decade, we provide absolutely no services to 40% of those children. Nothing. Not foster care, not counseling, nothing. We open an investigation, we determine that abuse and neglect has occurred, and we close the case. And to me, that speaks to the lack of capacity in the system to meet the needs of children and families. And so we can't expect change until we readdress the system and have a full continuum that goes from prevention to foster care to post-permanency, adoption assistance, and guardianship assistance. So then that leads me to the third question of how do waivers play a role in that? And I agree with Dr. Wilson that the most important lessons we've learned from the waivers have been around subsidized guardianships. And what we learned is that if you take children who are in long-term foster care, where you've already ruled out the ability to return those children home and ruled out the ability to have them be adopted, the question is, do they do better in long-term foster care or better placed with a relative who's willing to be a guardian but needs a little financial assistance to meet their needs? And we found out absolutely clearly that they do better with relatives. That's not a surprise to me, but that's what we found out. But we were able to test that in the construct of waivers, which have to be cost neutral, because we took out the long-term foster care dollars and we put them into subsidized guardianship. I think when you turn to waivers that talk about trying to invest in prevention and early intervention and treatment services, you're talking about something different. You're not pulling out foster care dollars and putting them into those services, because the dollars you have in foster care are, for the short term, fixed cost. Until you have the services like the public health nurse available, you're not going to keep children from coming into foster care, and you're not going to be able to send children home until you have substance abuse treatment and domestic violence treatment in place to keep that child safely back with their family. So I think we need to do both things. I think we need to move forward with a comprehensive approach that looks at investing additional dollars into the front end of the system and into the back end of the system, as Dr. Bell mentioned, post-permanency supports. And at the same time, as we begin to see foster care caseloads come down, we can then redirect those resources and make the 4E funding structure more flexible so they can be used to support those additional services. And I think that's what we need to do in terms of comprehensive financing reform. And I know that it's tempting in an economic environment like this to think about doing something that's cost neutral, that we can say is an option. But I don't think it's going to change the outcomes for children and families if we do that. And I want to remind you, as I ask you to think about investing new money, that what we're doing now is not something that's uncostly. We spend over $100 billion every year on the direct and indirect costs of abuse and neglect. About a quarter of that is in the child welfare system proper in terms of foster care and that sort of thing. The rest is in lost productivity due to long-term health consequences, substance abuse problems, mental health problems, involvement with the criminal justice system. So I sort of see it as we can pay for that, or we can pay to get the system the way we want it and get the outcomes we want for children. Thank you.